let's get to our panel. Pia, you already know. John Downey, a very familiar face at all these conferences. He has a stand out there. He has your pens are on your desk there. He is one of the foremost architects, town planners, planning consultants in the country. There are very few large-scale residential developments, particularly in the capital, that he's not across or directly involved with them. This lady, Fiona Cormican, is quite an operator. She is the biggest developer in the room, folks, when it comes to residential development. She is the chief commercial officer with Clúid. It is by far the single largest approved housing body. There are plans to build 3,000 houses, and this lady has assets of 1.5 billion that she's looking after. So that is no mean feat, quite an operator. And last but not least, when you can't get Michael O'Flynn, you get the next best person, who is Michael Kelleher, his formidable group operations director of the O'Flynn Group. And as always, you can expect a very earthy contribution of the frontline problems. So, look, you know Housing for All. You know the ESRI said we need a minimum of 35,000 houses a year, 20,000 last year, a bit of a pandemic excuse. It looks like 28 this year, but instead, as you heard from Downey, upward, as is required, it may actually go down. Viability factors, cost factors, perennial planning problems, and so on. So let's just discuss this, and I'll work along. Michael Kelleher, just tell us how you see all this demand. You know what I mean? How we're in the middle of a housing crisis. All this demand, young people wanting to get first-time buyers and homes and so on, and it seems to be getting worse. Why?
Well, there are many factors why it's getting worse, because we have hit a perfect storm with a supply chain which has arisen out of COVID and also arisen out of the Ukraine wars. So we have cost of materials have soared to scales we haven't seen before. Timber has gone up in excess of 60%. We have steel gone up in excess of 50%. And these costs are actually our raw materials that actually we build with, and it's driving the price of the product we are trying to produce. Because at the end of the day, our market are the people in this country who buy mortgages from the banks, which they have only a certain amount of capital they can get from the bank. And therefore, if our costs, which go to the bottom line, all it's doing is squeezing those people who actually can no longer afford the houses because of these huge cost increases. And so it's become very difficult then, because at the end of the day, the viability is a huge problem now because of these costs, which are not going to come off anytime soon. We're not going to see the costs, we are seeing them stabilizing somewhat, but at a very high price. And therefore, the cost of producing has gone further and further away from the vast majority of people. And so it's going to take a big collective, I'd say, approach for us to see us building more houses. We saw Downey saying their commencements have gone way down. They're gone way down because the viability is a big problem right now. Because in a lot of regional Ireland, it was just becoming to get viable to go building again. Because at the end of the day, we're building A-rated houses, which is fantastic, but there's a cost to building them. Now, they're fantastic from an operational point of view for the end user who can afford to buy them, because actually the cost of running them is probably a third of a normal type of gas, using gas or other energy sources. But the problem is the cost that we have to charge to recoup all our costs, including land and the planning system, which is very drawn out and is very costly, is driving the price of the product that we have to produce way beyond the means of most. And so I suppose what we have seen is the government's initiatives around cost rentals and around issues around homes first and things like that, where they're helping, I suppose, people who are the locked out generation, that they actually get a shareholder from the state, which takes some of the cost that they can't afford to reach because of the price of the houses, and share that with them. These initiatives are vital that the government keep pushing forward with these in a meaningful way, because otherwise the industry will completely slow down because, unfortunately,
And in terms of apartment development, where you can't phase it and you can only sell your first apartment when the last apartment is built, what does the cycle of the cost of money, availability of money, and hedge funds, what's that as an added problem? So the cost of steel and cement and cladding and all that, timber, we know about that, right? And you're fixed on selling the house at 450,000 or whatever, and that viability problem. But is there actually an additional problem that some of the success story in the 28,000 might not recur because of the interest rate cycle?
Absolutely, it's a huge issue. Obviously, the cost of money has gone up, and it's seen to go further. Obviously, as they try to control inflation, and that means that the funds are not, I suppose, partaking in the PRS schemes, which is the build to rent schemes, because it's no longer viable for them to do so. And obviously, it also means apartments generally are very expensive and much more expensive than houses to build. And we have a policy as well, which says that 40% of all development must now be in brownfield sites. And that's great, that's very aspirational, very good, because it's bringing, I suppose, development into a tighter city environment. But the problem is the cost of these brownfield sites and developing them means that they're not viable currently. And there's been a number of reports done by EY and by KPMG and others to show that apartment dwelling is not viable today, and therefore it won't get built. So what we're seeing now is 40% of what's planned for in the planning developments will not be built because it's not viable. And therefore that is a further issue and a constriction to the development. And it's time we actually looked at possibly, instead of thinking that high density is high rise, high density doesn't have to be high rise. There are many fine examples in Dublin and Cork, which were built 100 years ago, where they have tight urban streetscapes and their own door, and that's what we need to look at again, because we have a viability issue, and it's not going to fix itself anytime soon. And we need to look at other ways with new housing typologies that will still give quality homes, but actually do it in a different way.
Okay, Fiona. So we've the scene set there. Actually delivering houses at a price is getting more difficult. There's a cyclical factor. How has Clúid, with your targets, how have you responded to these challenges?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for the introduction, but I think there's probably a few people in the room who'd argue that we're the biggest developer in the country, but we are up there, definitely. How do we manage the cyclical situation? Well, unfortunately, our customer base need housing no matter what. If the prices are high, they're going to need housing. If unemployment is high, they're going to need housing. So we always have demand. And thankfully, at the moment, we have government policy supporting that demand with a huge investment in the social housing programme, which is great. So all of those things are good. But yes, we're building all across the country. We've over 1,000 units on site that we're directly building. That's separate from our developer acquisition programme. And we've another over 1,000 units in the various stages of the planning process. So we're building all over the country. So we know the prices of things. We know the volatility in the market. We know exactly what you know. We suffer all the same things you suffer. We suffer alongside you. And one of the reasons we became a member of CIF about 15 years ago was because I'm not out there with a shovel. I'm not out there laying blocks. We rely on this sector to work with us to deliver. We do design and manage our own projects on site, but we hire contractors to do it, and we hire architects and so on. So it's very important that we understand what your challenges are and that we can work with you on the challenges. So in terms of the viability, value is a bit different for us than it is for a private developer or private contractor. We see the value in the location because we need people to be able to live where their families are from. And we see the value in the upfront quality because then our longer term management and maintenance costs are lower. So we see value differently from maybe the private sector see value or a private home buyer sees value. So we're also very conscious that it is not in our interest to see contractors struggling on site. It's not in our interest to squeeze developers to the point where they can't go on site. It's in our interest to try and find the value in the quality that contractors and developers bring us, as well as a future pipeline of work when things change, when the situation changes, that they'll still continue to work with us. So that's one of the ways we deal with it. One of the other things we do is we have a developer design and build program, and it was targeted initially at medium to small developers, where developers come to us with their site, with their planning permission, and we buy the site and then we stage pay the project. We now find a lot of bigger contractors and developers coming to us with that because it takes the volatility out of the interest rates for them. We take that risk. Now, in return for taking that risk, we expect to get a price that reflects that, but it works very, very well. Now, that's a fixed price contract. And as I said, Clúid, they're not in the business of making, we want our projects to finish. So even though it's a fixed price contract, we're sitting down with all our developers and we're working through the price increases at the moment and the inflation impacts at the moment with the developers, and coming to a shared pain and gain arrangement with them on that. We could just say, no, sorry, fixed price, nothing you can do about it, but there's no value to that. It means projects don't get finished. It means developers can't finish the project. Contractors are being squeezed to the pin of the collar. So we will always work with the industry to try and make it work, because at the end of the day, what we want is homes for people who desperately need homes, and whatever we need to do to make that work, we'll do it. Now, at the same time, we know our prices all over the country. We know exactly what costs, so you won't find us an easy negotiating partner, but at least we'll be fair and we'll be reasonable.
And in turn, has your paymaster been reasonable with you?
They have.
You said we need to raise our unit price.
They have been very reasonable. They understand the market. I have to say, the Department of the Environment and Housing and the local authorities, they get it. They understand the challenges. And like us, their main aim is to get more houses delivered. And they're not going to create, we all have to be reasonable. We have to justify to them. We borrow from private institutions as well. So we have to justify to them.
So what does the future look like for Clúid? Say 23, 24?
I think it's already been said. There's a reasonable delivery this year. Next year will be a challenge. We're going to have about 600 units we'll deliver next year from our own construction program. We control that. Our developer program, we have about 1,000 units that should be delivering. I'm not sure where that's going to end up. And I think that is a problem. And I also think the delays that we saw earlier on commencement starting is going to have a knock-on effect into 2024. And what I really don't want to see is reactionary policies when that happens. When there's a reaction from the political sector and they go, oh my God, we're not getting our delivery, we need to do something. That's the worst thing you can do to this industry. We need stability. We need to know what's happening. Every time a new policy comes out, everything stops and has to restart. So the last thing we need is that. We need government and we need the politicians to recognise now we have a delivery problem. Now, today, and it's going to be hit in 23 and 24. And work with the industry and listen to the people who are on the front line delivering, not people who aren't out there delivering, but the people who are delivering, which is this room and us in the sector, and work with us to improve that delivery, but to actually really listen to us.
Okay, John, you've been involved, your firm, Downey Planning, with Savills in relation to the Dublin supply pipeline for housing. Tell us, that's going to be published shortly?
Good morning, everybody. Savills released a report there during the week.
Yes.
We're actually doing our own one.
Okay, tell me about that.
So there's a lot of data out there.
The
Housing Task Force.
Is there enough planning permissions in the system from where you sit to meet the requirement of the market? That's the question.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I've been coming here for a few years and there's a lot of issues about planning, and there's still issues with planning, but the supply of planning permissions has come up to the mark. And I'll give you an example. So our housing supplies report examination is kind of geostatistical information. So we're looking at each site individually. It's not just mass data, throw it in and see what comes out. And what we found out is that, and we're doing the figures from 2017 to September 2022, so right up to date. And what we found between 2017 and 2021, in the Dublin area, there were 64,000 grants of planning permission, of which only 26,000 were activated. So the activation rate for a planning permission is 41%. And we can talk here about increased costs, but the increased costs have only hit the market this year. The activation rate, I'm going back to 2017. So the key issue is that there is a supply of planner permissions coming on. But are they the right planner permissions? And are they the right planner permissions in the right location? So it comes down to a key aspect, which I've been kind of advocating for a while, that should be included in planning applications, is the viability of a planning application, the viability of a scheme. So, I mean, we've gone through the whole thing, the SHD process. There was 512 SHDs granted. There's been a huge amount of planning work gone in. So all those planning permissions are sitting out there in the Dublin region. They're not being activated. And one of the key findings as well is that I actually thought that the highest activation rates will be in Dublin City Council, because it's mainly apartments. But it's actually out in Fingal. And Fingal has a slightly different product. It's not high rise, high density, and it's still high density, but it's more homes, if that makes sense. So the issue is apartments, and there's a huge push for apartments, and there's a viability cost with that, where the average price of an apartment is probably up around 450,000 now. So for a developer to sell that, it's 550,000. How's that a first-time buyer's house, unless there's a large subvention of housing policy coming into the market? But that subvention isn't coming into the private market, it's coming into the Clúids and the social housing. So it's a two-tier market. And that analysis from planning permissions, I think, is important, because it defines housing policy and will define where we end up in 10 years' time.
So what's the solution?
I didn't bring solutions today.
No, like it seems to me that there's a dysfunction in the market from what you're saying then. I mean, in other words, have the planning approvals been for something that the market can't and won't build?
It emanates from Housing for All. It emanates from the National Planning Framework. I mean, give an example, there was, over that period, 2017 to 2021, there was 94,528 dwellings delivered during that period. And that's 30,000 less than the target market. So we're creating a shortfall, I think, by our housing policy, if that makes sense. It's not planning, it's not construction, it's not the individual things. But when you look at the new density guidelines, you know, that in 2018 when they came out, that advocated this push. So I think we need to go back and revisit the actual housing policy per se.
Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you is about the supply of land for housing and development plans.
Yeah.
And this is a nationwide issue in terms of dezoning of land and this focus, you know, into these brownfield sites that Michael referred to there. Is the best the enemy of the good?
Yeah, it's a big point. So again, with the Dublin local authorities, most of them are pretty much concluded the development plans. Some of them are at stage 3, stage 2s. But a lot of that information was based on the 2016 census information, which are incorrect. On that basis, you find that there's a serious lack of future zone land, zone service land being provided in development plans. The headroom provided is about 25%, but when you look at the activation rates of planning permissions, the headroom should be up around 100%. Then when you examine actual specific areas, and there's things called housing needs demands assessments, you go through areas, and we went through an area like Swords, which is like a major growth town in Dublin, like it's up there with Blanchardstown. It's there providing huge populations. There's a metro going in, it should grow. And we found, like, when you go through the individual pieces of land that are zoned, like, I'll give you an example, there was 15 hectares of zoned land service that's in the core strategy. It's taken out, you know, that's allocated, but it's Forest Little Golf Club. I mean, it doesn't make sense. That's not going to come online in the next 4 or 5 years. So that system is flawed as well, I firmly believe. And we need to rethink how we do development plans. They're drawn out processes. They take 2 years. They're very time consuming on councillors. And we need a larger plan, like a 15 or 20 year plan, which they do in other countries. And they can allocate, designate lands and have planning permissions ready to go on zone lands. But it's a twofold thing. It's the supply coming down the line, which is a 10-year thing. And then it's the activation rates currently with planning permissions, extant permissions in hand.
Okay. Don't forget, Slido, your questions. We had one question an hour ago, and because it's planning, I'm going to put it to you, John, and it gets into the wider question of the AG review and judicial reviews. This questioner calls themselves broken developer. How can we achieve the housing plan when the planning system allows individuals to set up so-called environmental companies to serially object to developments causing delays. In many cases, they delay a project over 12 months and then agree to withdraw if, quotes, the costs are covered. Let me put that in plain English. It's an extortionist situation of people who don't live remotely close to the development, have no ostensible skin in the game, have set up some pseudo-organisation, and they're just looking to maybe turn a buck. It's outrageous.
Yeah. So the planning system is being reformed, and it's been kept pretty much under wraps. But it's in effect the Planning Act itself. So the Planning Act came out in 2000. It's been amended for 22 years. The legislation doesn't work because it's been subvented by EU legislation. So what is proposed going forward is that if you are JRing a project, you have to be involved in objections, appeals, go through due process. So you can't object to height and density, and then when you go for your judicial review, put in something about bats. So it's about transparency, and then the local authority can basically request additional information, get a bat survey done, etc. And then I believe that they're going to bring in costs awarded if it goes south.
So do you think this review will be meaningful?
I do think it will be meaningful.
I'm full of concern, like Paul Kelleher was driving this himself. When the Taoiseach position changes, the AG is likely to change. And if he's leaving the building, that doesn't inspire.
Yeah, well, just give an example. So of the 512 SHDs that have been granted over the SHE period, which was quite successful, 91 of them were JR'd. That's a huge amount. And a lot of them are still in the High Court. And again, there's a huge amount of planning permissions sitting in the High Court, not sitting on the land. So it is something that we have to, I wouldn't say eradicate, but we do have the only planning system in Europe that allows third-party appeals. So we're effectively giving it on the double, which I think is unfair to developers, builders, and people involved in construction.
Pia, first of all, thank you for your compare and contrast UK, the Norwich and Manchester stuff is really interesting. And the key message, I think, is collaboration works. Now that you're back in Dublin and in Ireland, what are you observing about PRS and in terms of, we'll just say, the financing of private sector housing, leaving aside social? What are you observing?
Well, obviously, there's been a lot of money going into multifamily housing and build-to-rent housing over the last number of years. EY just published a thought piece on this. Our colleagues in Debt Advisory, based on their observations on the market recently, they've seen that the sentiment is still broadly positive on, towards Irish housing, particularly in tenures with with long-term income, such as multifamily housing and also student accommodation. I guess the critical thing is obviously the fact that with interest rate hikes, the cost of financing is getting higher. So even though there is sentiment and it's positive towards the sector, the increase in the overall financing costs will impact. Generally speaking, I think competition between investors is keeping the sort of margins down, but the credit analysis and the credit environment will become more conservative. So the actual quantum of finance that might be advanced might be lower in terms of loan to cost. But it generally speaking, the sentiment is broadly positive towards new build in the sector.
One of the points you made was the preponderance of a fragmented SME industry. Am I picking up that these problems that we've just described there are less so for larger developers, bigger apartment blocks? They take a longer term view, they have a deeper pocket. Would that be a fair summary?
I think the sort of security and financing sources that the PLC house builders enjoy is definitely helpful. Although a lot of work has been done by the HBFI to support the smaller sector. But yes, I mean, I guess that there is a disproportionate impact on smaller firms on both the cost inflation side, the wage inflation side, and also financing. So it's the long-term plans that the PLCs have to publish and have to be understood by their investors is helpful for visibility in securing supply on both the cost side but also on the financing side. So yes, it is something that is impacting smaller firms.
Michael, there was something you said that kind of sort of grinded with me a bit. Like today, the ESRI have said house prices are 7% overvalued and they're going to go backwards. Every time you turn on a radio or TV, rocketing rents, people, more than 50% of their net income going on this. Like, trees don't grow to the sky. Like, how do you see the market evolving? In other words, the market just can't absorb these extra costs.
Absolutely. I suppose we have to look at more efficient ways of how we build. And that goes back to John's point, starting with the planning and the development plans. We actually need to have a situation where we give clarity and actually a roadmap for people so that the communities at development plan stage get involved and decide how their communities will be developed. But once that happens and the development plan is laid down, it then should not be allowed that you can appeal unless if the development is delivered within the parameters of the development plan, whether it is the height, whether it is the density, where the schools go, everything. We have too much uncertainty in the system and it's really problematic, and we need to get that uncertainty out so that when you buy a tract of land, you should have a situation where you could know within a certain timeline you'll get the planning and then you can get to site. It takes too long to get it through the whole system. And we have to deal with that. We have to deal with house typology because apartments are too expensive. They'll be built in certain places, but not everywhere. And I also think that actually, as well as that, if we free up that and we'll get more efficiencies into the system and we'll build cheaper. New homes prices won't drop, I don't believe, because the reality is they're at an economic price. If you look at the statistics, it's the second-hand house prices moved ahead actually in the last 12 months, way ahead of new homes prices. And the reality is, if they dropped, or if there was a sense that they were to drop, they wouldn't be built because they're not economically viable. They're just marginal at the minute with all the cost increases, and you now have the end user, the purchaser, unfortunately, has to pay more for the mortgage. So it's very tight margins, and therefore we have to put efficiencies into the system. We have to get the infrastructure to run alongside the zoned land, and we actually have to get better planned. We have a 6-year plan cycle, as John alluded in this currently with development plans. It's too short. Like, you can't plan infrastructure and plan a whole community in that short timeline. We need 12-year cycles, and we need proper planning so that Irish Water, ESB, all the different utilities and those stakeholders, TII, actually get involved at the front end, and it's planned, and it takes all the uncertainty out of the system. And then we have some chance of starting to deliver homes, I suppose, more efficiently.
And could any of you give any insight into a potential productivity game changer? You as a buyer of houses, Fiona, in terms of off-site modular development or some other productivity or efficiency gain in the building process that might reduce costs?
There's lots of ways we could get efficiencies. First of all, there's far too many people involved in the whole process. Way too many people involved and way too many agencies involved in the process. And I very much agree with what Michael is saying there about once a development plan is in place that's been consulted with the community, then we need to stick to that, and that's what we should be doing. But also we need the planners and we need the planning authorities to consider the efficiencies. They don't consider the economics as John was saying, that we don't consider the economics of actually delivering something. So building apartments or insisting on apartments in schemes that are outside the city don't work. The only people who are buying them are us because we have a need for them. It doesn't work. And yet there's really good proposals out there about better use of open space that allows for less apartments, more duplexes, better use of a site. But they're not being listened to. And again, as I go back to the point, if you want efficiencies, you talk to the people on the front line who are doing it. If you want efficiencies in the health sector, you talk to the nurses. If you want efficiencies in this sector, you talk to the builders because they'll tell you how to do it and where the efficiencies come from. That's the gap. That's the piece of the missing piece. And you talked a lot, Pia, about collaboration in Manchester, which is really, really interesting. There's a sense of collaboration here, but there really isn't the sitting down and listening and talking to people and putting aside your own agenda. And, you know, politicians would say, yeah, but if you bring a group of developers into the room, all they talk about is the cost, and where their profit margins are being squeezed. Maybe this industry needs to think about putting that aside and really thinking about efficiencies. You bring politicians into the room, all they're thinking about is where they're getting their next vote from and, you know, how they can keep people happy. And I will say, one of the biggest objectors to schemes, and especially social housing schemes across the country, are local elected representatives.
Oh,
From all parties.
Class A hypocrites.
Yeah,
absolutely.
from all parties. Yeah.
Final question, we're out of time. I want to ask you, the hunt with the hare, chase with the hounds. Absolutely. The Land Development Agency, it's a few years in gestation, fit for purpose, working well, scope for being a game changer. Anyone, we're way over time, anyone want to make a comment on the LDA?
I think it has the ability to be good. Without a doubt, I think people are judging it too soon, but it's only just really in its infancy. But just on one of the points you said about solutions, one thing I think would work is where councils get more involved and they create like active land management. They're there to assist developers. You come in, they get you your planning permission, they get you your water connections, they assist with the Part 5s. It's not all trying to open doors and, you know, shove doors open. And I think councils should be, you know, active land management. But the problem with that then is that the residents and the people out there will see that councils are now facilitating developers, and that's a bad thing. But housing is like a right. It's an important piece of infrastructure. We're in a crisis. We need to change the mindset. We need to get councils actively engaging with developers and assisting them to go from planning to on-site.
Okay. Yes, my final word, yeah.
It's actually, as Pia alluded to, it's actually us all, incumbent us all, to make this work. That includes the Land Development Agency. They have a role to play. The housing agents have a role to play. Builders, developers have a role to play. Planners, the architects. We all have a role to play in this. And unless we start coming at this as a collective and actually deciding how we're going to fix it together, and not be siloed down, we'll never get to grips with this problem. We have to actually start deciding how we're going to get better output, more efficient output into the industry by collectively working as a complete team.